They say the castle never slept. Stone walls don't close their eyes. And behind every noble's throne, behind every armored knight, was someone, sweeping, cooking, shoveling, polishing, serving, watching, quietly, invisibly, but never unimportant. We hear stories about kings and queens, knights and nobles. But this time, let's do something different. Let's open the heavy door of a medieval castle, and instead of looking up at the banners, we'll look down, at the boots that never leave the kitchens, at the hands that wash the tunics, at the broom in the hallway, the eyes on the wall, and the hands feeding the fire. Because this castle, it runs on people you've never heard of. And tonight, I'm going to tell you about every one of them, every single job. So if you're ready, go ahead and turn your fan on low, pull the blanket up, get your phone charger to a good spot, lock the door, dim the lights, and maybe close those endless tabs on your mind for just a little while. You don't have to stay awake for this. Just settle in and let your thoughts soften a bit. We're going to walk through a castle in slow motion. You'll see what time looked like when it moved slower, when your title meant everything, and when the people behind the scenes stayed there. Let's start at the bottom. Literally, the lowest, smelliest, most forgotten job in the entire castle. The gong farmer. Now I know what you're thinking. Gong farmer sounds kind of poetic, but it wasn't. It was the medieval job nobody wanted, but someone had to do. Gong was just the old word for human waste, and farmers didn't grow it, they removed it. Imagine being summoned in the dead of night to climb down a latrine shaft, into a pit dug below the castle's privy, a place no sunlight ever touched, and shovel out layers of waste. The kind that had been sitting, fermenting for months, sometimes years. No gloves, no real tools, just rags and buckets and a very, very strong stomach. Gong farmers were often paid in food, ale, or small coin, and they worked in shifts, usually after dark. It wasn't just gross, it was dangerous. Toxic gas built up in those cesspits. Some of them fainted down there. Some never came back up. But someone had to keep the latrines usable. And believe it or not, some of that waste was repurposed. Fields outside the castle would be fertilized with it. If you were lucky, the gong farmer would take the buckets far away. If you weren't, let's just say your morning walk in the garden might be earthy. From the pit, we'll move to the kitchen. And oh, the castle kitchen. It wasn't just one room. In large castles, it was an entire wing. A labyrinth of heat, firewood, barrels, smoke, dogs underfoot, and orders being shouted over the clatter of iron pots. And here we meet a different kind of labor, the turnspit boy. Usually a young servant or orphan, the turnspit boy had one job. Crawl into the wheel, start walking, and don't stop. Imagine a hamster wheel mounted in stone, with a long axle that turned the spit over the fire. The spit held a haunch of deer, or maybe a wild boar. And it needed to turn slowly, evenly, for hours. So the boy walked, sometimes for 10 hours straight, sweat dripping, smoke stinging, blisters growing. Some castles eventually replaced turnspit boys with dogs trained to walk the wheel, but many didn't, because boys didn't bark or bite, and they could be scolded when they slowed down. It's easy to forget how much work went into just roasting one meal. But in this castle, food was constant, and behind that food was always someone tired. Standing nearby, you'd find the scullery maid. She wasn't there to stir soup or bake bread. She was there for what came after, dishes, and not porcelain plates and silver forks. No, we're talking about crusted iron cauldrons, charred pots, greasy trenchers made of bread, and knives dulled by bone. Scullery maids scrubbed it all, by hand, in cold water, with sand or ashes for soap. They worked in the steam and wet, always wet, splashing, scrubbing, and stacking. Their hands stayed red, their backs stayed bent, and nobody remembered their names. Not far off, in a quieter corner, worked the spicer. Now this was a slightly more respected position, usually held by a man who could be trusted. Why? Because spices were like treasure. Cinnamon, nutmeg, black pepper. These were expensive imported goods, locked up in tiny cabinets. The spicer was in charge of measuring them out, keeping track of every pinch. He worked with scales, keys, and records. And if anything went missing, well, even the softest castle walls could echo with punishment. Let's climb up now. Not to the noble's chambers, not yet. We're stopping at the pantry. Now don't think pantry like in a modern home. This wasn't just a shelf with flour. This was a full room guarded, measured, and managed by a team. The pantler was in charge, a title you've probably never heard. The pantler kept the bread, not just any bread, but whose bread? In medieval times, even bread was hierarchical. Coarse black bread for servants, lighter rye for soldiers, white bread for lords, and it all had to be tracked. How many loaves baked? How many slices served? Who didn't eat what they were given? Alongside him was the butler. Before he was serving champagne in white gloves, the medieval butler was the keeper of the butts, the barrels of ale and wine. He managed the drinks, measured the rations, made sure no one watered them down or drank without permission. Butlers had keys, and in the castle, keys were power. Now let's step into the laundry. It doesn't sound exciting, and it wasn't, but it was constant. Tunics, cloaks, sheets, undergarments, napkins, bandages, and no machines. Laundry workers boiled water in giant pots. They used urine, yes, human urine, to lift stains. They beat garments on rocks, rinsed them in rivers, hung them in the courtyards, and hoped the birds wouldn't leave surprises. They did this day after day, and the work never ran out. One step up from the laundress was the chamberlain, a more senior servant who handled the lord's private chambers. He was like a personal assistant, housekeeper, valet, and secretary rolled into one. He knew when the lord would wake, when his bath should be poured, when his clothes should be laid out, and when secrets should be kept. A good chamberlain knew what to say. A great one knew when to say nothing. He moved silently like the castle itself, always present, never noticed. And speaking of silence, let's not forget the night watch. They didn't get much praise, just the cold. These were guards and stewards who patrolled the halls, the battlements, the courtyards. While everyone else slept, they listened, to the wind, to the creak of the stairs, to the click of a rat's claw. Some of them were armed, some just carried lanterns, and the castle trusted them with everything. One slip, one missing shadow, and everything could fall. The night was long, but they kept walking. Every job in this castle was a thread, and if you pulled just one, the whole place might unravel. We've only just started. There's the falconer, the huntsman, the cook, the seamstress, the scribe, the porter, the groom of the stool, the nursemaid, the minstrel, the reeve, the stable boy, the armorer, the candle maker, the bath attendant, the bell ringer, and every one of them has a story, a place, a task, a silence. We'll get to all of them. But for now, maybe close your eyes. Let your thoughts wander across stone walls and mossy corridors, and know that behind every great hall, there were quiet hands, doing loud work. I'll be right here. We'll keep going, together. The master-at-arms was the man responsible for teaching the young squires and knights in training how to fight, but also how to behave. Swordplay was only part of the curriculum. They had to learn how to carry themselves, how to bow, how to speak to a lady, how to eat in front of a noble, how to fall off a horse and not cry. He would wake before the boys, inspect the field, test the training weapons, and wait. And then day after day drill them into form, staff strikes, shield blocks, mounted exercises, wrestling in the mud. And when the boys grew into men, he trained them again, because war was always a season away. But the armor those knights wore, it didn't clean itself. Enter the armorer's apprentice. While the senior armorer was trusted with forging and fitting, the apprentice handled the grunt work, scraping dried blood off chainmail, oiling plates to prevent rust, bending under tables to find lost buckles. testing the leather straps, patching dents, counting every rivet. He was the one holding a candle at 2 in the morning, trying to figure out why the elbow joint jammed. And if something went wrong in battle, it was his fault. Nearby, you'd hear the rhythmic beat of hammers in the smithy. The blacksmith wasn't just making horseshoes. He made hinges, locks, nails, tools, grills, grates, and bars for windows. He kept the castle from falling apart. His hands were calloused, his clothes always dark from soot, and his forge burned hot in both summer and winter. Even the most powerful lord would wait if the blacksmith hadn't finished the key to a new gate. Now let's step quietly past the chapel. Inside you might find the castle chaplain, not a flashy man, but one who knew Latin and scriptures and the secrets of every soul in the keep. He blessed the meals, the marriages, the sickbeds, the newborns, and more often than most wanted to admit, the dead. When the winter was hard and the pantry empty, the chaplain was the one explaining suffering as a test. When enemies knocked on the gate, he was the one praying out loud while gripping the cross tighter than he'd ever admit. He kept the faith burning even when the candles went out. Now step down the winding stairs, to the cellar. This was the realm of the cellarer, not just a man with keys to wine barrels, but the overseer of all food stores, dry goods, and rations. He had to know how long salted pork would last, how many onions could be eaten before the next cart arrived, how to spot a moldy wheel of cheese before it sickened half the kitchen. His records were precise, not because he was obsessive, but because a miscount could starve the whole staff. He tracked sacks of flour like a banker tracks gold. Alongside him worked the alewife. Yes, even women had roles in castle work. The alewife brewed the beer. It was safer than water. And people drank it all day, not to get drunk, but because it was clean. Brewing was a science of temperature, time, and taste, and one bad batch could bring stomach illness across the castle. She worked with hops, yeast, barley, and a good nose. Her brews were so reliable, some castles relied more on her than their physician. Let's step outside now, toward the stables. You'd hear them before you saw them. The grunts of horses, the clatter of hooves, the swish of tails. The stable boy had already been awake for hours, mucking out stalls, laying down fresh hay, brushing coats, checking shoes. He knew each horse by name, knew which one bit, which one kicked, and which one would ride quietly in a storm. He wasn't just feeding animals, he was preparing soldiers' legs. A knight on foot was just a man with mettle, but on a horse, that was fear. And the stable boy made that fear possible. Close by you'd find the farrier, hammering out new shoes over a flame. His work was half smith, half vet. He'd inspect hooves, trim them, check for rot, drive in nails with precision. He was trusted. Because if a horse limped into battle, the man riding it wouldn't walk out. Just beyond you'd find the kennel master. Castles kept hounds, not pets but hunters. Sleek, fast, muscular dogs trained for deer, boar, even wolves. The kennel master trained them, fed them, bred them, healed them, named them. And when the Lord wanted to hunt, the dogs had to be ready. Fast, obedient, silent, until the right moment. In the still of the castle evening, you might hear one bark echo down the stone hallway, and know that tomorrow, blood would be spilled in the forest. Let's move on to something quieter, something softer. The seamstress. She didn't just patch holes, she crafted appearances. She adjusted gowns for visiting ladies, added trim to tunics, stitched banners for feasts, and occasionally designed something entirely new. She worked by candlelight, bent low, her fingers nimble and fast. Thread by thread, she shaped how the castle looked, even though most would never know her name. And in the room next to hers was the laundress's apprentice, sometimes a young girl, sometimes a cast-off noblewoman, fallen on harder times. She boiled water, lifted soaked sheets, hauled baskets heavier than herself. The stone floors froze her feet in winter. The steam flushed her face in summer. And the smell of wet linen never left her clothes. But she sang sometimes, softly, while scrubbing out stains that wouldn't come out, as if melody made the task easier. Back upstairs, there was another quiet role. The nursemaid. She wasn't a midwife. She was the one who stayed after, who rocked the baby when the mother slept, who wiped noses and packed baskets and remembered birthdays when the father forgot. She learned the child's cries, knew which ones meant hunger, which ones meant loneliness. And if the child ever rose to power, the nursemaid would be the only one who remembered them as a teething, drooling, stubborn little creature. Next door, the tutor worked in a room filled with scrolls and dust. He taught the young lords Latin, math, the law, the Bible, and the names of every kingdom that mattered. He was strict, underpaid, and often lonely. But his students would grow up believing they were born to rule, because he told them they were. Even further up, in the tallest tower lived the falconer. His birds were noble, feathered royalty. He trained them on leather gloves, rewarded them with bits of meat, taught them to return on signal. Not because it was showy, but because a trained hawk could feed a small household in winter. He wore thick gloves, carried a hooded kestrel on his arm, and smelled like wind and raw meat. Some say falconers never slept, because their birds heard everything. Below the falconer's loft was the bell ringer station, a small chamber with ropes, pulleys, and one job, mark time. The castle lived by the bell. Morning prayer, midday meal, evening curfew, fire watch. The bell ringer listened to silence all day, and then, once every hour, broke it. And no one ever thought about the man pulling the rope. Far beneath the bell tower, below the echo of even the heaviest footstep, was the domain of the undercook. Not the master of meals, not the one who announced menus or carved roasts in front of noblemen, but the one who did the quiet cooking, the stews that took 5 hours, the bone broths that simmered through the night, the pies no one thanked, but everyone finished. The undercook worked with smoke in his eyes and fire on his hands. He rarely left the kitchen. He was part of it. If a feast was a performance, the undercook was the stagehand who made it all happen. Close by was the herb mistress, sometimes called the green wife, sometimes the still-room matron. She was the keeper of the garden, but not the flowers, the healing leaves, the ones you could crush into paste, steep into tea, or tuck into a wound, mint for headaches, yarrow for bleeding, chamomile to calm the nerves, and sometimes poppy, for when the pain needed to be forgotten. She worked with stained fingers, dried bundles hanging overhead, and a knowledge passed down mouth to ear, woman to woman. In a world without hospitals, she was the hope. Now let's pass the kitchens again to the room where the ewers were stored. There you'd find the yeoman of the ewery. Not a glamorous job, but a vital one. He was in charge of water, not just getting it, but storing it, distributing it, heating it, making sure the Lord's basin was clean, the wash bowls full, the bathwater bearable. He managed the linen cloths used for hand washing before meals, and he counted them carefully, because even rags were valuable. Next door was the napery, and here worked the napkin keeper, an older woman usually, stern and quick-fingered. She handled the cloths for dining, not just napkins, but tablecloths, towels, seat covers. She washed them, pressed them with warm stones, folded them precisely. During feasts, she stood silently at the back of the hall, watching for spills, ready with a replacement. The napkin keeper knew who wiped their mouth like a pig and who folded their cloth like a noble. Sometimes the smallest jobs noticed the most. Let's move now to the solar, the Lord and Lady's private sitting room. Here in hushed tones worked the lady's maid. She brushed hair that reached the waist, helped lace corsets so tightly they left no breath, sewed pearls onto sleeves, listened to whispered worries, brought water for tears. She knew which jewels the lady hated, which slippers hurt, which days the mirror was turned toward the wall. She carried secrets in her silence, and she wasn't alone. The valet de chambre, the male equivalent, handled the Lord's garments. He folded the cloak before it touched the bed. He polished the boots no one saw. He laid out the sword on feast days and the dagger on bad ones. He knew when to knock and when not to. He wasn't just a servant. He was the man who woke up early so his master didn't have to. Let's go higher, up narrow stairs into the oldest part of the keep, where the floors creaked no matter how lightly you stepped. There, often alone, lived the scribe, a man of ink and candlelight. He wrote letters, copied manuscripts, kept accounts. He held the history of the castle in parchment. His fingers were always blackened, his back always hunched. He heard the gossip through orders and requests, but never repeated it. The scribe wrote birthdays before anyone else remembered. He recorded debts no one wanted to pay. And when someone was born or buried, he was the one who inked it into permanence. Below his chambers was the tally room, where the reeve worked. The reeve was part manager, part accountant. He oversaw the peasants and field work, tracked grain in and out, settled disputes over sheep grazing and stolen tools. He knew every inch of land the castle claimed, and who worked it, and who lied about working it. The reeve wasn't liked, but he was obeyed. Now let's step outside, into the brew yard just behind the kitchens. Here was the candle maker, tallow and beeswax, boiled, filtered, poured into molds, cooled, trimmed. It sounds simple, but the castle consumed candles faster than they could be made. Every chamber, every hallway, every prayer. And when the moon was gone and the wind was high, a candle could be the only difference between safety and stumbling into danger. The candle maker worked all day so others could see all night. Beyond the walls near the river was a smaller structure, often overlooked. The mill. The miller there wasn't castle staff, technically, but the castle depended on him. He ground the grain brought in from the fields. He knew how fine to grind for bread, for porridge, for paste. He controlled the speed of the wheel, listened to the stones, and he was watched. Because millers had a reputation, fair or not, for keeping a little extra flour for themselves. He said it was payment. The reeve said it was theft. Their arguments echoed through centuries. Just beyond the porter's post, in the shadow of the wall, stood the watchman's walk. This was where the watch sergeant made his rounds. He didn't carry a sword most days, just a staff and a lantern. His job wasn't to fight, but to observe, to know which torches had burned out, which locks had rusted, which hinges squeaked louder than they should. He took notes in his head. He spoke little, but he remembered everything. At night, when the castle rested, he walked, quietly, step by step. Above him, stationed on the battlements, were the lookouts. These were men who saw farther than most, trained to notice details. A shimmer in the distance, smoke on the horizon, a rider too far from the road. They lived in small towers, ate in shifts, and learned how to read weather like scripture. Because sometimes it wasn't an army approaching. Sometimes it was a storm. The signalman stationed beside them kept a stack of flags and horns. His messages were wordless but urgent. A raised red cloth, 2 short blasts, a silence that meant everything. And inside the castle, someone was always listening. Below, tucked beside the eastern wall, lived the gardener. He wasn't a florist. He grew what the kitchen needed, what the apothecary requested, what the chaplain used on feast days. He knew when the frost came, how to lift potatoes without bruising, which roots healed and which poisoned. He worked under the sun, under the rain, and under the gaze of the walls. The garden was simple, but it fed the complicated lives behind the stone. Now let's head inside again, up the servants' stair, to the pages' quarters. Pages were young boys, usually of noble birth, sent away from home to begin their training. They polished armor, ran messages, held cloaks, stood still for hours during dinners they weren't allowed to eat at. They learned humility first, then swordplay, then diplomacy. They were the background of power, learning how to eventually step into it. Older pages became squires. The squire's life was harder. He tended to his knight, kept the armor clean, fed the horse, sharpened the weapons, and in battle, he followed behind, sometimes carrying water, sometimes pulling the wounded to safety, and sometimes picking up the sword when the knight could no longer lift his. Each squire hoped for knighthood, but not all reached it. Across the hall in a warmer chamber, the chandler's apprentice kept tallies. The chandler made candles, yes, but also soap, rushlights, sealing wax. The apprentice melted wax over coals, stirred the vats, snipped wicks, watched for bubbles. One careless motion, and the wax would burn. He never spoke during work. His focus was total. Because fire was the most dangerous tool in the castle, and the most necessary. A little farther down, in a corridor filled with dusty shelves, was the library, if you could call it that. A small, quiet room with books chained to desks and scrolls stacked in crates. The librarian wasn't what we imagine today. He was more like a guardian. He tracked every borrowed volume, cleaned the parchment, re-inked faded lines, bound pages that had loosened in the damp air. Books were rare. Each one could take months to create. Losing a single page was like dropping gold into a well. So the librarian didn't sleep easily, and often didn't sleep at all. Below that quiet room, far beneath, were the storage vaults. Here the storekeeper watched over everything that didn't yet have a place. Wool sacks, empty jugs, spare weapons, extra linens, casks sealed with wax, salt blocks, dried herbs bundled in rope. He had an inventory in his head, inked onto parchment only once a week. He was the castle's memory. If something went missing, he was asked first. If something needed finding, he answered before the question finished. Now cross the courtyard, past the well, to the forge's assistant. He wasn't quite a blacksmith, not yet. He hauled coal, bellowed the flames, fetched iron bars, cleaned up the mess when shoes cracked or swords bent. The smith trusted him. Eventually, he'd learn by watching, then by doing, then by failing, and starting again. Years later, his hands would look just like the master's, scarred, soot-colored, and strong. Nearby, the cooper built barrels. The wheelwright made carts. The carpenter repaired beams. Each had a job so specific you only noticed them when they stopped doing it. Barrels leaked, carts wobbled, stairs creaked. The carpenter was a quiet man with an even quieter hammer. He kept the bones of the castle strong, and when wood wasn't enough, the mason stepped in. He patched walls, reinforced towers, replaced stone steps worn down by generations of feet. His chisel spoke to the rock. He measured with rope and sight, and he was one of the few who understood how the castle truly held together. Now step softly into the main hall. Empty now, but filled, not long ago, with firelight and conversation. Look at the walls. See the tapestries. They weren't just decoration. They held warmth, silenced echoes, told stories. The embroiderer who made them worked for months, sometimes years, on a single panel. Gold thread, dyed wool, beads and bone. They stitched battles, hunts, myths, family crests. And in the corner, always a small symbol, the artist's mark, invisible to most, but proof that someone's hands had moved across that fabric inch by inch. Now look up, to the chandeliers, carved of iron, hung with chains, lowered with a crank. They needed cleaning, wicks trimmed, candles replaced, soot cleared. The ceiling sweeper, a real job, used a long pole with a brush wrapped in damp cloth. Once a week, he'd sweep the rafters, removing cobwebs, scaring mice, choking on dust. Nobody saw him. But if he stopped working, everyone noticed. Even above that, on the roof walk, the pigeon keeper tended to birds, not just for food, for messages. The castle used carrier pigeons in emergencies. The keeper fed them, trained them, clipped their wings just so, and memorized which ones flew best with which routes. He trusted the sky, even when no one else did. At the farthest edge of the outer courtyard, where the stones turned to mud and the walls gave way to trees, stood a low shed of sorts. Not quite part of the castle, but not separate either. This was where the tanner worked. You could smell the place before you ever saw it. A pungent mixture of hides, lime, urine, and smoke. The tanner took raw animal skins and turned them into leather. Leather for boots, gloves, belts, scabbards, reins, armor straps. Everything that touched the body or the horse. It was grueling work. Soaking the hides, scraping the hair, soaking again. Then pounding, stretching, and drying until the hide became soft enough to bend, but strong enough not to tear. It took weeks to make a single usable piece. And the smell never left your hands. Next to the tanner's shed was a shed of another kind, where the charcoal burner worked. He stacked wood into perfect round piles, covered them with earth, and lit them from inside. The goal wasn't fire, but heat without flame. Slow cooking the wood into pure carbon. Charcoal black, brittle, hot burning, and essential. The kitchens used it. The smithy lived by it. The castle owed its tools, its meals, and its warmth to a man most people didn't want to stand near. The lime burner wasn't far off either. He made lime from stone, heating limestone until it cracked and powdered. This powdered lime was used for building, for whitewashing walls, for tanning, and sometimes even for treating wounds. His fires burned hotter than most, and his clothes were always dusted white, as if the walls he covered had claimed him. Back inside the main structure, let's walk into the infirmary. It wasn't a hospital, but it was where the sick were sent, and where the infirmary did their quiet work. They brewed herbal remedies, applied poultices, cleaned wounds, whispered prayers when words ran out. Some were trained, some were just good listeners with steady hands. Their patients ranged from injured guards to feverish cooks. No one was turned away, but not everyone walked out. Next door was the herbarium, tended by a physic, a sort of medieval healer. He studied plants, roots, infusions. He believed in balance, hot and cold, wet and dry, bitter and sweet. He measured humors, checked pulses, tasted urine for clues. People doubted him, until they needed him. Then suddenly the man with the dried foxglove and mortar became very important. The barber surgeon worked in tandem with him, a more hands-on man. He pulled teeth, bled patients, lanced boils, set bones. He shaved beards with one hand and cut into skin with the other. His blades were always sharp, and his table always stained. Now let's move to the chapel once more, because here, hidden behind the altar, worked the sacrist. He cared for the sacred vessels, polished the chalices, changed the altar cloths, kept track of the candles and the oils. He rang the bells for Mass, swept the aisles, laid out the vestments. To others it was a job. To him it was reverence. He moved with silence, and his every motion was a kind of prayer. Outside near the gate you'd find the messenger, always half-packed, always watching the sky. He could be called at any moment, to carry a letter across the next valley, to ride through rain, to deliver word of birth or death. He changed horses at way stations, slept in barns, ate whatever he was given, but he held messages that could change lives. Sometimes when he returned, no one noticed, but when he left, people watched. At the gatehouse, there was also the gatekeeper. He wasn't a soldier, but he could deny an army. He opened the gate only when told, closed it quickly, checked wagons for hidden blades, marked names in a ledger. He didn't talk much, because talking could get someone in who didn't belong. He knew that silence was security. And then, hidden behind the heavy doors of the treasury, was the Chamberlain of Finance, often just called the Exchequer. He held the keys to the coin chests, counted rents, filed taxes, recorded fines. He knew what every tenant owed, what every feast cost, what every sword was worth. He wore ink on his sleeves and suspicion in his eyes, because trust in a treasury was a dangerous thing. His assistant, the coin clipper, tested the money, weighed it, scraped edges to check for tampering, bent suspect coins with tongs, even in a castle where swords were drawn. Some of the most serious punishments came from stealing silver. And yes, it happened often. Near the ladies' quarters, the midwife waited quietly. She was only called when it was time. No one looked her in the eye until then. But once summoned, she became the most important person in the castle. She carried herbs, cloths, warm stones. She knew when to speak and when to hush the room. She had seen miracles and heartbreak. She never raised her voice, but everyone listened. Beside her sometimes stood the wet nurse. She fed the child when the mother could not, or would not, or was too noble to do so. The wet nurse gave her own milk, and often her own heart, because babies don't know titles, only arms. And sometimes the wet nurse became more mother than servant, though no one said it aloud. Up above, in the grandest guest chambers, the master of revels was preparing, not for war, but for a feast. He managed the entertainment, scheduled musicians, planned pageants, rehearsed plays, hung tapestries. He knew which guests liked comedy, which ones drank too quickly, which songs brought tears. His work was joyful, but exhausting, because delight, like dinner, had to be served on time. Back in the scriptorium, the illuminator painted the margins of manuscripts, tiny angels, winding vines, golden suns. The pages glowed under his brush. He used crushed stone and egg yolk, gold leaf, colored dust. Each page took days, sometimes weeks, and when the book was closed, his art disappeared until someone opened it again. At the laundry, in a low corner, the moth ward kept watch. Yes, a real job. She inspected linens for holes, kept cedarwood in drawers, hung sacks of herbs to ward off pests, because one moth could ruin a season's worth of cloth. And when the lords were gone, when the halls were empty, when the shutters creaked in the wind, she walked the closets, with a lantern and a broom. There was even a vermin catcher. He laid traps, spread ashes to trace paw prints, set poison in corners, listened for scratching in the night. No one liked him, but everyone needed him, because rats did more damage than most enemies, and so he hunted quietly, with boots soft as moss. Not far from the vermin catcher's trails, near the grain storage, worked the bird scarer. It might sound like a child's job, but it wasn't. Birds, left unchecked, could ruin everything. They pecked at seed sacks, nested in rafters, dropped waste on clean linens hung to dry. The bird scarer moved through the outer yards with a wooden clapper, or shook tins filled with stones, or just waved his arms at the right moment. He didn't shout. He didn't chase. He simply knew where to be, when to appear, and how to look. Just scary enough. Sometimes he carved crude owls from wood, painted on eyes, placed them high near the windows to frighten smaller birds away. No one praised him. But the grain stayed clean, and beside the grain towers, another quiet figure moved. The rat charmer's apprentice. It wasn't an official title, but everyone called him that. He carried herbs known for their scent. He whispered to ferrets, trained to slip through walls. He laid down flour to trace tiny footprints, then followed the trail. He worked with traps, but also with instinct, and where others stomped or poisoned, he observed. He watched how rats moved, where they slept, which walls they favored. He didn't kill with cruelty. He removed with purpose. Just beyond, inside the main keep's archways, was a quieter job still. The key bearer. Not the lord, not the steward, but the man entrusted to carry the physical keys to the cellars, the wine room, the coin chest, the guest quarters. A small ring of iron loops hung from his belt, each one precise, each one labeled in his own shorthand. He spoke only to those who had permission, and opened doors only with a nod from someone higher. He never left the castle grounds, not because he wasn't allowed, but because his absence meant someone else might carry those keys, and he couldn't allow that. Beneath the keep, in narrow tunnels few dared to walk alone, was the fire warden. His job wasn't to build the fires, but to monitor them. Every hearth, every stove, every forge. He walked with a damp cloth tucked into his belt. He knew how to smother flames without smoke. He memorized the sound of a fire burning too hot, too wild. He checked the coals, watched the ashes, knew where the breeze slipped through cracks and fed the flames when it shouldn't. When everyone slept, the fire warden watched, because one spark could bring the whole place down. Above his path, tucked near the guest hall, the mirror keeper polished reflections. Glass was rare, mirrors even more so. They were backed with silver, delicate and finicky in candlelight. The mirror keeper cleaned them with vinegar and wool, handled them like parchment. adjusted their angle each morning so light hit just right. He also knew which mirror caught which doorway, which one accidentally reflected things it shouldn't. He said nothing, but he saw everything. Back in the storage rooms, stacked high with spices and roots, the spice keeper worked with quiet reverence. Spices were more valuable than gold: pepper, cinnamon, clove, saffron, nutmeg. They didn't just flavor food, they preserved meat, healed illness, signaled status. The spice keeper measured by weight, by finger, by breath. He locked the caskets each night. He counted every clove. No one dared steal from him, because spices weren't just ingredients, they were power. In the lantern hall, the lamp trimmer made his rounds. He trimmed wicks, refilled oil, cleaned soot from glass. He lit lamps at dusk, extinguished them at dawn, moved with a pole and a stool and silence. He knew which hallways were walked at night, which rooms were supposed to stay dark. He walked a loop every evening, and if a single flame had gone out, he noticed. Above him, in the guest wings, the bed tester had already done his job. He checked that straw was dry, that feathers were fluffed, that nothing crawled in the sheets, that ropes were tight beneath the mattress. He plumped pillows, smoothed wool blankets. A bad night's sleep could insult a noble. The bed tester made sure that didn't happen. He slept on the floor. In the courtyards, the saddle repairer worked in the mornings. Leather cracked in the cold. Buckles tore loose. Padding shifted. He sat on a short stool, needle in hand, wax thread between his teeth. He stitched in loops, checked each loop with a tug. The horses didn't care, but the riders did. And next to him, the horn polisher handled the castle's signal horns, curved bone, scraped and carved. He wiped them clean, checked the mouthpiece, tested the sound in the open air. Some horns were ceremonial, some were for alarms. He knew which was which, and he kept them ready. Inside, deep in the inner chambers, the chess master waited. Yes, chess. The Lord liked to play. And the chess master, part tutor, part strategist, always let him win. But not too easily. He explained the rules to guests, set the board, studied moves, wrote new variations. He played against himself on cold days, against bored nobles on rainy ones. He never raised his voice, because thinking is always quiet. Near the entrance to the pantry, the cupbearer tested wine. Not for flavor, for poison. He took the first sip, held it in his mouth, waited, swallowed, then nodded. It was a job of immense trust and incredible risk. He watched who poured, who smiled, who didn't drink. His loyalty was in every swallow, and if he ever refused a cup, that cup was never touched again. Let's walk now to the scroll vault, the castle's memory. Here worked the archive warden. He kept maps, treaties, birth records, contracts, land deeds. He wrote in a tiny, perfect script, stacked scrolls in rows, hung parchment to dry, stored seals in beeswax. He remembered where every name was written, and what each name had once meant, even if that name had been erased from the world above. At last we end our walk near the old bell tower, where a single figure, bent over a stone slab, carved letters with a chisel. The epitaph maker. He didn't speak to the living. He worked for the dead. Each letter was struck in rhythm, slow, measured, final. He carved names into permanence. And when he was done, he brushed the dust aside, stood back, and said nothing, because silence said everything. As the bell tower faded behind you, and the great shadows of stone gave way to morning mist, you'd sometimes see her. The washerwoman, bent at the waist, sleeves rolled, feet sunk into wet earth. She didn't work inside the castle. She worked beside the stream, in the coldest months, in the rain, in the wind that made fingers go numb before sunrise. She soaked garments in wooden tubs, beat them on flat stones, rinsed and wrung, scrubbed stains with ash and lye, When linen froze while hanging, she snapped it gently. When soap ran low, she boiled fat and wood ash into something usable. She hummed, sometimes, when no one else was near. She returned clothes white, dry, and folded, no matter how filthy they'd been. And she remembered whose shirt had blood, whose sleeve had ink, whose collar smelled of perfume not worn by a wife, but she never spoke of it. Farther down the slope, tucked behind the edge of the orchard, worked the bee ward. He kept hives in rows, watched the drones, listened to the queen. He could smell when a hive was angry, hear when honey was ready. He harvested with smoke and stillness, and spoke to the bees as if they understood. Sometimes when a lord died, he'd walk to each hive and whisper the name. They said bees should be told when someone important passes. He believed that, and so he told them. Inside again, near the lowest arch of the inner hall, moved the silent broom. No name, no title. Just a woman, or a boy, or an old man. Someone who swept, who moved when others didn't, who brushed rushes back into the center, who picked up crumbs from under benches, who cleared ashes from steps. No one noticed them, but without them, dirt would pile. Hallways would reek, insects would come. They swept and vanished. At the stables, beside the horses, was the hoof boy. Not a farrier, just a boy. He lifted hooves, scraped out packed stones, washed mud away, held buckets steady. He was kicked more than once, bitten twice, but he kept returning, because even the youngest could serve. In the kitchens again, the egg counter worked quietly, a basket, a tally, a small bit of chalk. Eggs were delicate, easy to crack, easy to steal. He counted every one, marked down each cracked shell, and reported it weekly. He didn't cook, didn't clean, didn't stir pots, but breakfast depended on him. In the northern wing, the draft stopper walked the halls before dusk. He checked windows, stuffed rags in cracks, hung wool cloths over doors. He knew where cold wind slipped in, knew which rooms the baby slept in, and which old bones ached with even the smallest breeze. He sealed the castle from the inside, so others could rest. Upstairs, behind the carved screens of the music hall, was the instrument tuner. He handled the harp, tightened the lute strings, cleaned the flute mouthpieces, tuned the dulcimer. He played a single note softly, again and again, adjusting, listening, adjusting again. He wasn't a performer, but the music began with him. In the narrow corridors where torches cast long shadows, the shadow boy watched the flames. He wasn't really hired. He just lingered, sat by the wall, moved when asked. He handed messages, ran to fetch water, listened when no one else would. And sometimes he warned of trouble before anyone else saw it. No one paid him. But when he disappeared for a day, people noticed. He came back with a bruised eye and didn't say why. But his place by the wall was still warm. Outside the armory, near the grindstone, the edge tester worked. He wore thick gloves, handled every blade once, ran a scrap of cloth across its edge, checked for nicks, reground those that needed it. He didn't fight, but he knew which swords could cut and which ones couldn't. When the knights rode out, they never asked about him, but they carried his work into every battle. Above him, near the battlements, the falcon boy stood still. He held a heavy leather glove, watched the skies. He trained hawks to fly, to return, to hunt. He learned the calls, the waits, the moments of silence before the dive. He didn't talk much, because birds don't like noise. He simply waited, until wings returned, and finally, there was the one no one knew, the night knocker. He made a slow circuit hours after midnight. He tapped 3 times on certain doors, soft, precise, just enough to wake the person inside. No one ever saw him, but bread was always started early. The guards always changed on time. The fires were stoked before sunrise. He never missed a night, because someone always had to start the day before the day began. And so, all across the castle, the day unfolded, hour by hour, task by task. And each job, each broom, each key, each cup was part of something greater. Not just a place of kings and knights, but of cooks, washers, sweepers, listeners, of quiet hands doing quiet work. Work that held up the world. The castle never slept. But maybe now, you can,